From the hidden secrets of our backyards to the realities of the third world, we take a raw and real look into the challenges and the pursuits of social justice. Welcome to The Point. When I first heard Dr. Larson speak, I was blown away by his ability to talk about a complex and difficult subject with such eloquence and grace and love. He's authored over 13 books. His wife Hannah and him have been working in the juvenile justice space for years, and they now run an organization that's in over 300 detention centers, 15 states, and 5 countries. As though that's not an accomplishment enough in itself, he's also a professor at the Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary Center for Urban Ministerial Education. Dr. Larson is the co-founder of Every Youth, Every Facility initiative, which focuses on partnering with ministries to reach every youth in the 1,200 detention centers throughout the U.S. He's joining us today from his sunny springtime home in Worcester, Massachusetts. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Scott Larson. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me today. Did you grow up in Minnesota?
Yeah, I grew up in Minnesota. Kind of southern Minnesota mostly. Yeah, but I've been out in Massachusetts, 36 years, maybe 35 years now.
Oh, that's a while.
That's a while, yeah.
And how do you pronounce your wife's name? Is it Hannah?
Yeah, it is Hannah. She's from Denmark, so that's why it's a little different spelling.
Very cool. Did she grow up there? Or did she grow up in the States?
Yeah, she grew up in Denmark.
Oh, cool.
And from there, she worked with Youth for Christ in their youth guidance program, which was like inner city, South Minneapolis.
And you all met, did you meet in college, was it, or?
No, I was a stockbroker after college, and she was working with Youth for Christ, and I was volunteering and kind of running a program in my community, and we met at a Youth for Christ staff conference. So that's how it happened. And then she had the same kind of vision to go into the juvenile facilities, but they didn't allow that or have that when I left and went to seminary out at Gordon-Conwell Seminary. That's how I ended up out here.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so she kind of launched the ministry 34 years ago in Massachusetts. And then I joined her as I discovered, I left to work with leadership youth and came to realize a lot of them were in juvenile lockup facilities, just leading in different ways.
Yeah, I love that. I love that part of your story. Started as a stockbroker. And so how old were you when you decided to make that shift out of that career path?
I guess I had my first midlife crisis around 23. I've had many since then, but it was kind of that realization that, this is all there is, just making a lot of money, which God graced me with that early. And I thought that was the whole game, I was a Christian and all, but I started to wonder if this is all there is, I'm not sure it's enough for me. And then I started to take my vacation smuggling Bibles into China and Russia. That was in the mid 80s, and really encountered people in the underground church and
wow,
their faith and what life was like for them. And it was a lot different than for me. That got me really thinking, what is it I'm supposed to do? And I had started volunteering, working with youth in my community in the local high school through Youth for Christ. And that became like the thing I thought about all week were those kids. And then I felt God calling me to go into training, and I was to work with leadership youth. And so I did that. I went to seminary, and I was traveling, speaking at a lot of youth conferences and Christian schools and camps and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then when my wife started the ministry in juvenile jails in New England and Massachusetts, and I went in with her one time, to be a support. I had no real interest in these youth, but the first kid I met, he had asked if I could pray for his court date. So I said, okay, you're trying to beat the case or what? And he said, no, pray that I tell the truth. And I said, well, have you talked to your lawyer about this? And he said, yeah. I said, what did he tell you? He swore at me because I could do 20 years. I'm only 15, but he said if I pled guilty, I could do 20 years in adult prison. So that really got my attention. Like, wow, you want to tell the truth. And so I definitely prayed for him, went back the next week, and he was still there, and he had pled guilty, and this lawyer swore at him, and he was now going to go to sentencing in 5 months. So I started to go in every week just to try to help him get ready for this, because he said, the Bible says you're supposed to tell the truth, right? And I said, yeah, but, doesn't mean God's going to get you out of whatever you did. And he said, I didn't think he was going to get me out of it, but I don't want to leave the way I came into here. And, he'd had a real experience with Christ in his life. So we followed him through that whole process, and the judge decided to keep him in the juvenile justice system till he was 21 instead of put him into the adult system. And that was a big thing. He had really changed. He had an impact on her life and certainly my life. And I realized these were the youth that God had called me to work with, real leadership youth who were willing to put it on the line like that. And many of them, are leading in their communities. I mean, if you can make money when half the people are trying to kill you and the other half are trying to arrest you, you have something in the leadership department. And I found that to be true all these years later. Not broken people to be fixed or troubled youth, but leaders who've had a lot of trauma and can be realigned to lead in very powerful ways.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So talk to us a little bit about, as a social work major, I love talking about like people first language. How do we talk about this population? Do we call them delinquents? Like what's the new vocabulary that we should be using?
Yeah, we like to describe them as justice involved youth, as you're saying, more asset-based and positive. I mean, usually you don't talk about your nephews as delinquents or your children. It's a derogatory term. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to reframe the narrative of who these young people are. Mm-hmm. And it makes a difference when people started speaking about human trafficking instead of prostitution. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of interest to help. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the jobs of us who work with this population. I mean, in one sense, they're less than 1% of the youth population. They commit more than half the crimes. Mm. So they're a key place to invest. One kid that enters a life of crime, quits school at 16, estimates are that it costs society about $2 million over the life of that young person. But there's the other part of it that they do tend to be influencers and leaders. And when one of them really turns, the impact is pretty big on families, on communities, on peers. They bring a lot of people along with them. I think about it almost like the book of Acts. The Lord added to their number daily those being saved in Acts 2 and 4. But when Saul of Tarsus flips, it says the church multiplied. Mm. And we've seen that happen. Like really cities transformed when we could bring rival gang leaders together and they reconciled and could actually create a lot of new momentum in a community. And so I think that's important to give terminology that more wants us to engage with them as opposed to avoid them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those of us who haven't stepped foot in a juvenile center, what exactly does it look like? Like, how old are the people that go in? What type of crimes do they commit? Is it like we might imagine a prison where there's, bars that they're locked up on? Or how does it give us like a visual of what exactly it looks like?
Well, it's different in every state. Some are like that, look very institutional prison-like. Some are more group home, but about 1 million kids a year are arrested, actually. And about 500,000 pass through the juvenile justice system. Sometimes they go to court and they go back home on an ankle bracelet. Sometimes they go into a detention center. Many of them, if their family had means, they probably wouldn't end up there. They'd be bailed out, for example, but they sit and they wait for their court date and then they get sentenced. And either way, it's a tough place. If you think about your own child at 14, 15, 16, being in an institution with other peers who are challenging it as well, it's not an easy place to be. But what people find out over and over and over who go in is like, wow, they're just kids. I had an image in my mind of who they were, like these urban terrorists or something. And it's just like, wow, they're just very respectful kids. And it's not so much, what did you do, but what's been done to you. A lot of times hurt people. And, you just seldom meet anybody who hasn't had significant trauma. I saw one study, 87% had been either shot or stabbed. 70% have witnessed somebody being killed before their eyes. 40% meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Only for many of them, it's an ongoing, and not a post-traumatic, but an ongoing traumatic stress disorder. They live in a lot of trauma. And what we know more about trauma behavior is hurt people. And so the old ways of if we punish them enough, then somehow they'll get better. I think we're finally realizing as a society that pain and then adding pain-based behavior, which is punishment, pune is the Latin word for pain, is not going to probably yield something healthy. So how do we build on the strengths of that youth? How do we create authentic community around them? How do we bring the gospel in a real way that they can hear and embrace? I think about the parable of the sower, where Jesus talks about the different kinds of soil. The one that bears 30, 60, 100 fold is soil that's been disturbed, which detention centers are disturbing places for sure. Weeds have been extracted, and detention centers are places where you're devoid of all the things that may have gotten you in there, negative peers, drugs. And then there's the watering of the seed, which I think it's Psalm says we sow in tears to reap a harvest of joy. And definitely somebody's been praying over this kid, a grandmother, a mother, somebody has had a lot of sleepless nights. So it's a fertile ground for bringing in the love of Christ through an authentic messenger. It just can love on them and they respond.
So is that kind of what you saw, like as you began to visit these different places and have conversation with these kids, is that there wasn't necessarily a holistic approach to recovery? I read on your website that 70% of the 1,300 facilities where kids are locked up have no faith-based program. So did it start with like you and your wife visiting and you met your first kid and it really began, you were like, we need to do something, and you began to multiply? Or what was kind of the timeline of growing yourselves and growing your ministry?
Yeah. Well, my wife had been going into detention centers in Minneapolis with Youth for Christ. They have a program, an arm of their called Juvenile Justice Ministries. But when we were married and moved to New England, they didn't allow any kind of religious programming or people from the outside. So she got an experiment and we started to do that. And initially it was just, wow. The staff started to see how when kids came out to these programs, they were much calmer. It was making a difference. They may not have bought the religious part, but they could see that people coming in from the outside who don't get paid to see them makes a difference. And so as we began to expand it in the 6 New England states, and I joined her when I finished seminary and we started Straight Ahead Ministries. The other issue that started to come up was, okay, kids get out and they go back to the same environments. I remember meeting another young man, Thomas Jefferson was his name, from Boston. And he was describing, going back and being, is there another place I could go? Because he had people that wanted to kill him back on the street, and he was turning 18. So, the system was done with him. And as good as a system is, it can't make those connections often to the community where kids go back to. And so I tried to find places, that might take in an 18-year-old gangbanger, because he wasn't looking for like a teen challenge program. He'd already been in programs most of his teenage years. But we couldn't find a place, and then found out a few weeks after he was released that he'd been shot in the back of the head by a rival gang and was killed. We began to just like, what was he looking for? What was he wanting? It was a place to belong. And God started to speak to our hearts about that. And then in 1990, we opened a home for up to 7 boys at a time that got out of lockup and didn't want to go back. So they were done with the system, but they wanted to go into what we call the leadership development home. And we took in boys that lived with us. And, one of them is now a lawyer and on our board and my boss, and several are counselors and group home workers, a couple are police officers, but very, very few. I mean, less than 6% were ever rearrested that came out and decided to go into that kind of an environment. And so we really ran it as a home. I think of the verse, 1 Corinthians 4:15, Paul said, you might have had 10,000 teachers, but not many fathers. I became your father. So fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers in the gospel, I think that's the secret sauce for any of us to really grow into all that God has called us to be, especially for these kids.
Mm-hmm. And so when you started doing this, a lot of our listeners work in human services and different areas of social justice. And likely we can identify with like a lot of those heartstrings, that are happening, and the Lord like leading you on a path and introducing you to people and having these pivotal moments. We can also identify with like burnout and bad boundaries and all of the, we hear success stories a lot. And I think like those are what keep us going. But did you and your wife experience burnout, or maybe you still do, where you just want to wash your hands and say, I'm done with this? And if you do, what prevents you from giving up?
All of that, particularly, taking kids in your home, I wouldn't recommend it. We had our own children, 5 years into that process, only because it brings up so much in you. And I think, what helped me is to finally quit praying, God, change them to change me. And then there was plenty to work on for that. But I think a couple of things, I remember hearing Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industries, say, how do you keep getting from being burned out? And he said, if I felt it was my responsibility to change somebody else, I'd be burned out in a minute. But is there something I can learn from somebody who's gone through more than me? And I think that helps. I think, God, how can you change me as I'm showing up in this in my worst ways as well? When I take too much of it on as my responsibility, I'll burn out. When I think I can't do anything to make a difference, as I've been at that place many times, I remember asking either these kids are too far gone to change, or they can't embrace what we're offering really to change, or we're doing something wrong. One of those must be real, because it seems like it's not working. And then God will surprise you, with a kid who said, hey, do you have any more of those Bibles? It's the first book I've ever been able to understand. It's like, oh, really? Wow. So it's like, hold on loosely, and at the same time, dare to give yourself fully, and know that there's plenty that will come up for you to work on for you, and there'll be enough spillover to make a difference in the lives of some kids. And I think for those who maybe work in the system too, and feel like, we're so restricted from really being able to do what wanted us to get into this in the first place. It's amazing, talking to kids on the other side of it, because now a lot of the kids we worked with in the early days are in their 40s now. It's often a staff or two that make a difference, real difference, and gets into the mind of somebody, and they'll say, I want to be like that. Like the kid who's on our board now, his lawyer that took his case but treated him like a son. And that's what gave him the vision to be a lawyer, to help other kids like him. And they are very slow to trust, but they're long on loyalty, because you have so few people that you run across who are, as Yuri Braunhofer said, every kid needs somebody who's wildly crazy about them. And when you find somebody like that, it changes you, it gets in your psyche. And you don't need a lot of people like that. But for these kids, one or two is unusual, unfortunately. And so they make a big impact.
You've shared with us a few stories. Do you have one in particular that sticks with you the most?
There are many. The young man who is on our board now, when I met him at 14, he was in a gang and came to Bible study. He'd never been to anything Christian before. He'd never really heard of it, but just looking to get out of his room. And And when we talked about vision for your life, and he described, wanting to be a lawyer like his lawyer, but he was in for a gang murder. So talk about a long shot, right? He was potentially looking at 15 to 20 years. And in fact, under current laws, he would probably still be in, because back then you could be tried as a juvenile. He didn't do it, but he was there when it went down. And we just kept in touch with him. And he went to another facility, got involved in a Bible study there, and then was going to reunite with his father, who he met when he was locked up. But his father already had 10 other kids and wasn't willing to take him back. His mother was on the street. She was an addict. So he came to our home with the idea he was only going to be there a short time, as they were trying to reunite him with a family member, but stayed with us for 2 years, finished school, went on to Wheaton College in Chicago, actually, on a full scholarship.
Wow.
And was a much brighter kid than he realized, or other people, because he dropped out of school in 8th grade, and Wheaton's not easy to get into, but he graduated, with a 3.65 grade point average, and got into law school at Seton Hall, and had to be in the top 10% of his class to maintain his scholarship there, which he did. But then, as he was going to get the bar exam, when he finished all of this, they didn't let him in because of his juvenile record from when he was 14. And that was talk about a blow to everything.
I can't imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. And we stayed involved. I did his wedding. He got married. And a few years after, he had just a job at an insurance company. He said, you have this vision, Brian, and maybe you should try again. And he didn't want to go before that ethics committee. That was a grueling process. Mm-hmm. But he eventually decided to, and they let him in. Now he manages a $40 million budget with an organization that works with this very population. He's the CEO of it. And, 4 kids, and, they're not a lot of those stories. So when you ask me one, he's probably the one I'm going to pull out of my back pocket. But there are a lot of these kids out there. And part of what we love to do is provide a platform that people can see, this is the Onesimuses, like in the book of Philemon, who was the runaway slave from Philemon who stole from him. And according to early literature, went on to become the bishop of Ephesus, and I love to see, I think we all love to see those stories. God take the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and they're out there, but they don't happen automatically. Somebody advocates, like Paul advocated for Onesimus, his supporter Philemon, to forgive what he did and release him as a slave of yours and make him an equal, a free person. And apparently he did it.
That's incredible. So talk to us about how your organization works now. I'm sure it's evolved over the years, right? With lots of trial and error, but you're in more than 300 juvenile centers in 15 states and 5 countries, which is incredible. So how does it work? You do have trainings in each state, and you create volunteers, and those volunteers, tell us kind of the logistics.
Yeah. So we have direct ministry staff in the 6 New England states. We train people to go into there are about 65 different places where kids are locked up. So we train people from local churches, try to get that church connected to that facility in their backyard, do Christmas gifts at Christmas, just to be thinking about them. And they have people that from their church that go in regularly to lead what we call Bible discussion groups. And then we have 9 staff who work in the reentry, primarily in high crime cities, and they've mostly come up through. They were locked up as kids themselves, so they got a lot of street smart. And then we have this initiative called Every Youth, Every Facility, where we work to establish ministries around the country. As you said, 70% on average of the 1,200 juvenile jails in the United States don't have any kind of Christian programming. And even though it's a right of youth, you can't withhold religious services if you hold them in confinement. It has to be done in a certain way. It's voluntary, it's positive, it's not condemning, it's relational, it's interdenominational, all of that. So we establish those programs, and we'll establish new organizations with people who feel called to do it, and they become our affiliates around the country.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we've actually moved the needle pretty significantly over the past few years about the number of facilities that have ongoing program, and we try to connect those people who feel called to do this to each other and innovative models. I was just down in Austin, Texas with our affiliate this last week and called Jail to Jobs. And what they do is they just create businesses and jobs for kids down there. That's kind of their model. And others have other elements, more residential, aftercare homes, or provide chaplaincy services. So there's many different ways to do it, but the common theme of what's needed is a loving, caring person, who can go in and love on kids and bring the hope of Christ into them, and hopefully keep working with them when they get out, when things get a little more challenging than they are when you're just behind the wall in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Walk with them through all the ups and downs that they go through. And so we have about 450 youth in our community-based reentry programs in Massachusetts. That's our primary home territory that we work with to help get jobs and get connected into serving in their community and education and all of that.
So what would you say to somebody who's, the two different people that might be listening to this? One is the person that is like feeling those heartstrings and is like, I've been waiting for this. This is what I want to do. And maybe somebody that is also feeling that way, but also feeling very intimidated. If you haven't been involved with this population before, you can feel dumb sometimes, right? You might say the wrong thing. You might not have the street cred that, to get you into the door type of a thing. So what would you say to those people and how they can get involved?
So we have a website, everyyouth.org. Everyyouth.org is the Every Youth, Every Facility initiative we have. And on there's a map, and people can find where there's a facility right near them. There's 1,200 of them, so there's probably something close to you. And see if there's something going on there or not, and then connect to us. You can connect to me, Scott, at straightahead.org, and I can direct you to the right people. We have people all over the country who are doing this and can be good recipients, because you can't just knock on the door, find the phone number for the local detention center,
right,
and show up. It needs to go through one of the gatekeepers in a way. So that's, people who have an interest in their home area. And then there's a lot of resources on there too. Those who are like, help me understand, who these kids are. We have a certificate in juvenile justice ministry course that's online, and people can get to that a few ways, but one is ijjm.org. That's the Institute for Juvenile Justice Ministries, ijjm.org. And they can just enroll. It's like, I think it's $9 or $10 for all 15 courses, and you get a certificate in juvenile justice ministry. They're not long, but they're very practical. Mm-hmm. We also have a podcast that comes out called We're Still Standing. So if you go to everyyouth.org/podcast, each month, a young person who's come up through and getting to understand from their world. Some are focused on addiction or gangs, a number of challenges that they've overcome and how that happened. Anybody who has a tug at their heart, I think, have a lot of avenues that they could get connected in. You're needed. People aren't fighting over the turf. There's a lot more demand than supply.
Do you think that's just because there's like a misunderstanding of what this population is and what it looks like? And like I said, maybe it just feels a bit intimidating.
Well, part of it is because they're minors. There's a lot of confidentiality. So in their smaller facilities, they're probably hidden. It's not like the state prison that people drive by with their razor wire. And I think, the combination of youth, troubled youth, criminal behavior, it's intimidating. And people think, this is the one group I probably don't want to get too close to. And yet, inevitably, when you begin to see who they are, your heart gets immediately warmed. It's like, this is easier than teaching Sunday school at my church, or youth group, as you know, from having experience here. And then I think it's just, out of sight, out of mind. Heard of adult prison work, prison fellowship, juvenile delinquents. I hadn't really thought about that. So it's a kind of a forgotten mission field.
We almost forget that teenagers turn into adults. There's a piece of prevention in this.
Yeah, that's right. The pathway is, we hear a lot of these school to prison pipeline and, juvenile detention to prison pipeline. It's pretty well defined path. And, kids, when they end up in the juvenile justice system, have fallen through a lot of safety nets. At a family level, a lot of times at the school level, they typically don't learn in the ways that most of the schools teach. Social services, community. And so they've fallen through a lot of these when they enter this system. But many, this is where the turning point is, if somebody is there and they meet somebody who sometimes just believes in them a lot more than they believe in themselves. And they take some risks, because it's a risk to change what's familiar for all of us. And even for kids who've been through some horrific things, it's not easy to change, and nobody does it alone and by themselves.
You touched on it earlier, and it's something that I'm passionate about trying to advocate for and also implement in my personal life. But the idea that, people are intimidating until you learn their name, until you just say hello, until you look them in the eye. And honestly, none of us are that much different than each other. And we might have come from different backgrounds, but you're right. A lot of us have done really stupid stuff in our youth, but we might have been, in a padded environment with a family with a bit of money or a good lawyer or something that has led us down a different path. So the idea that the more we can get to know each other and have just good conversation, the more we realize, oh, this could have been me, or this could be my kid, or all those things that seem to separate us don't separate us anymore.
That's right.
I like to always end by asking what's one thing you want listeners to take with them today. But before we do that, I was listening to one of the podcasts that you had recorded, and I had never heard it explained this way. But again, working in international missions for 10 plus years, there's this idea, and you kind of said the toxicity about not working for money, but working for significance. Do you remember you saying this? So if you can, you don't remember? It was super powerful because I wrote it down. I was like, I've never heard it explained that way. So kind of you were describing about how you grew up believing the ultimate American dream, right? Is make more money than, the neighbor down the street. And so we can then take that same mentality. And if we're working in human services, we're saying okay, well, what's the goal, right? You always need a goal. And if you're not pushing out success story after success story, you can feel failure. But what you're doing is you're inevitably putting that pressure on that individual who's already in an oppressed situation. Yeah. And that's completely fair.
So, there's a lot of talk about switching from success to significance. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a trap that I fell into, switching from monetary success as a stockbroker to, I want my life to be significant. And then the problem with it is that for me to be significant means that the kids I'm working with have to change for the better. And if they don't, then that means I'm not significant. So
exactly,
that puts a lot of pressure on them and me. And when they don't change as they're supposed to, then I'm a failure. And so a lot of my anger was coming from that place. Sometimes it's described as the two halves of life, success, the first and the second, significance. But I think it's more like a hockey game where you have three periods: success, significance, and then perhaps surrender. I don't really need for you to change for you to be worthy of love. I mean, of course not. But something has to shift in me to make a place for that. You don't have to change at all for me to love you and for you to be worthy of love. There's a saying in the transformational training world, which we work in that model, that significance breeds resistance. The more significantly more significant it is for me that you change, the more you're going to resist me. Trying to get you to get this. Now that doesn't feel good. That somebody's got an agenda for me. And if I can release some of that agenda and just be with people, especially kids who are pretty suspicious of, what's in this for you. And they're going to probably, before they buy into what you're saying, they're going to try to sabotage it first and see if you'll still hang around. That's just
very accurate.
Right, stay safe when have been hurt a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They can be right about me and I can be right about them, and why these kids really don't want to change and nothing changes. That may be missing. God really has for me and for them. And ultimately, I wouldn't have gotten as far as I have if it wasn't for these kids exposing just my motives, that were so twisted. Like, I have to have you change so I can be something or significant. Who's that about? We can get into this and cause a lot of damage when we're not aware of potential that we can cause a lot of damage, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember hearing you describe it that way. Made so much sense, because after, living full-time in Haiti for years and seeing broken relationship after broken relationship after, it was once called the Republic of NGOs because there's more NGOs per capita than any other country in the world. And just this constant frustration of why things weren't working, and then seeing individuals, including myself, that pressure cooker you're talking about, which is okay, I did not know I had these issues. I did not know I could be this angry. I did not know I could be this arrogant, this conceited, this God complex that is inside of us, that leads us to maybe this place of significance in the first place, or that idea of finding our purpose in life. But if we don't have accountability and we're not in a good mental space, it can become very toxic very quickly. And the very thing that the very oppression that we're trying to remove from people is the exact oppression that we're putting back on them.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. What is the one thing you would want people to take with them from this conversation?
Yeah, that I guess, maybe rethinking who these young people are. I think of this whole idea of proximity. Brian Stevenson speaks about it a lot, the Just Mercy, the book and movie.
Mm-hmm.
Coming close, in which Jesus did, came and took on skin, as it says in John chapter 1, moved into the neighborhood. And that things really happen when we step closer to people that we would normally be apart from, especially coming out of a pandemic where we've isolated even more. And it always takes a risk to step into somebody else's space, but then stepping in with, what do they have to teach me versus what do I have to teach them? Nobody wants to be the mission field. Jesus never entered in with people that way. When he came to the woman at the well, he asked her, can you help me? Can you get me a drink of water? That was a very powerful move when she felt she was under him in that culture and in every kind of way. And it opened up something so powerful that an entire city came to faith through that one woman. And it's the longest encounter he'd ever had in all the Gospels, almost all of John chapter 4. And I think you don't get burned out when you step in like that, and you just become curious and, wow, see God, show me something of who this person is. People don't resist someone wanting to know about them. They resist someone wanting to tell me about me. I've got a message for you. Well, that may not be so welcomed, but when there's something I can learn, then it opens up something more like, I think, what Jesus had in the conversations he had with such people. And you'll be forever changed, and kids will experience something powerful as well.
That's so good. So Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I don't think so. You can, find straightahead.org is our website. We have a lot of materials on there, books written by youth. Everyyouth.org has opportunities across the country to engage. So just take the next step. If something is tugged at your heart, the next step will lead you to the one after that, right? Mm-hmm. And before you know it, you'll be connected with somebody that may just change your life, unforeseen place.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I am been very inspired by your work since I discovered you a few weeks ago. You're so busy, so I appreciate your time. And
all right.
All right. Have a good day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
As always, we'll have all relevant links in the show notes at lapointefoundation.org and also on Instagram at LaPointe Foundation. Dr. Scott can be found at straightahead.org and at everyyouth.org. You can email him directly at scott@straightahead.org. I'd like to thank Dr. Scott Larson again and his wife Hannah for all they're doing in the world and for making the time for us on the Point Podcast today. And thank you for taking the time to listen. Until next time, keep on fighting for justice.